So we'll now reconvene the Budget and Appropriations Committee with our 11 a.m. panel focusing on law enforcement coordination, which will be led by the Mayor's Office on Criminal Justice. I've been joined by Councilman Ryan Dorsey from the 3rd District, Councilwoman, Vice President of the City Council, Sharon Green Middleton from the 6th District, Councilwoman Shannon Sneed from the 13th District, Marguerite Kern, staff to the committee, Ms. Rebecca Tabb, counsel to the Baltimore City Council, Michael Huber from Council President's Office, Councilman John Bullock from the 9th District. And so, Mr. Vetter, if you would like to go ahead and lead us through your presentation, you can be as expeditious as possible. I know there are plenty of questions from various council members.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Councilman Pinkett. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to present on behalf of Law Enforcement Coordination and the budget for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. I'm joined by some members of my team, as well as some colleagues from the State's Attorney's Office and Baltimore Police Department as part of the panel as well. Mr. Chair, would you like for the panelists to introduce themselves? Or?
Yeah, please forgive me. If you could introduce your panel, and you could either, if you're seated, just signify by raising your hand so that the committee.
Can we just have everybody stand up and just briefly give their name?
Please.
Okay, I'll start with.
So Tyrone Roper, Director of the Office of Community Safety and Engagement within the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice.
Right. So let's do this. So Drew, you might just have to introduce who they are because you're at the mic,
okay.
and then they can just signify by, as they're standing, just raise their hand so that everybody knows who they are.
Okay. Tyrone Roper, Director of the Office of Community Safety and Engagement within MOCJ. Drew Vaught, who's our data specialist within MOCJ. Carrie Yerrico, who's Associate Director for Criminal Justice Coordination. Kenya Osley, who's our grants manager, and Jacob Knapp, fiscal administrator. And we're joined by colleagues from the State's Attorney's Office as well. Maybe if they could come up briefly to the microphone and introduce themselves with name and title.
Okay.
Good morning, Camille Blake-Fowl, Chief of Administration.
Lisa Smith, the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs.
Terrence Nash, Crime Strategies Unit.
Good morning. My name is Charles Blancos. I'm the Division Chief for the Gun Violence Enforcement Division.
Good morning. Mike Schatzo, Chief Deputy State's Attorney.
Good morning. Gerald Collins. I'm the Division Chief for Major Investigations.
Thank you. And we'll be joined by Ms. Caroline Sturgis from the Budget Department, as well as Ms. Karen Stokes from the Mayor's Office.
And from the Baltimore Police Department, we have Danielle Butcher from the Police Commissioner's Office and Jim Gillis, who's the Police Commissioner's Chief of Staff.
Thank you.
So I'll be very brief with the slides. We only have 4 services within MOCJ to speak to. So we'll go through the services briefly and then get into the questions. So our first service number 617, Criminal Justice Coordination. This reflects the function of MOCJ where we're playing a coordination role. And under this service, the budget, which supports primarily personnel, since I assumed this position in August of last year, we've started a number of new collaborative meetings, regular monthly meetings among criminal justice partners. We have a regular meeting with all of the juvenile justice involved agencies operating in the state and city. We have a regular meeting with the state's Department of Parole and Probation. That includes the state's Attorney's Office, the state's Parole and Probation Department, the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, Baltimore Police Department, of course. We have begun a regular meeting to talk about case outcomes. We had the first meeting last week with the Baltimore Police Department, State's Attorney's Office, where we're reviewing data and trying to identify opportunities for enhanced collaboration. Out of this service, we're also providing support to the Baltimore Police Department on a number of initiatives that they have, specifically the Strategic Decision Support Center program that is being implemented in the Eastern and Western police districts that we're providing support to. As well as providing support to the police stat process. And I think that you've already heard from the Mayor's Office of Sustainable Solutions and CityStat, but we're a participant in the police stat portion of that. Next service. I'm actually not sure who has the control of the PowerPoint.
You do.
I do. Where? Oh. So service 618, whereas the previous service was focused more on direct coordination among the criminal justice system and our law enforcement partners, service 618 we've established as the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement within MOCJ. And this service is really all about crime prevention, crime interruption programs and initiatives. Tyrone Roper is the director of this function. This is where we'll be providing leadership to the expansion of the Safe Streets program and management going forward, as well as the ROCA program, which you've heard about, which is set to launch in the city July 2nd. We have a grant-funded visitation center, which provides supervised custody exchange and visitation, which is typically ordered by the court in cases where there's intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and that supervision is needed. And this is where we're also researching other potential programs and initiatives aimed around violence interruption and prevention. MOCJ manages the budget for the City Watch program. So operationally, City Watch supports BPD, but the maintenance budget is managed by MOCJ due to the coordination that's needed among all of the partners. City Watch involves the police department, it involves the Mayor's Office of Information Technology, Department of Transportation, housing. It's really a multi-agency effort to maintain and expand this network. So currently we're adding about 120 cameras to the system, which would make it the largest expansion by far the largest expansion since about 2012. Much of this network was built out with federal Homeland Security dollars that have really dwindled over the years. But an expansion is being enabled currently through a couple main ways. One is the grant funding that we received from Bloomberg Philanthropies to expand the system to bring ShotSpotter online and to add license plate readers for the police department. And the other is the South Baltimore Gateway Local Development Council around the casino impact funds. Cameras are being added to those communities currently as well. And our final service supports administration. This is where some of the unallocated allowances for grant funds are housed. We've hired, and she introduced herself a minute ago, we've hired a grants manager within MOCJ to be very proactive in seeking federal and state grant opportunities. We're in the midst of grant season right now, and we've worked on proposals that could, I think when you add them all up, it's over $3 million worth of new requests that we've put out in the last couple of months. The most notable among those are a federal grant for a crime gun intelligence center, which is a model that's focused around collecting ballistic evidence as quickly as possible and disseminating leads to detectives for follow-up. And so we put in that grant application, as well as supported the police department in a number of grant applications that they've submitted. One of the largest is an application to a federal grant funding to expand the Baltimore Police Department's crisis response team, in which licensed mental health professionals are riding with specially trained police officers, responding to calls for service that involve someone experiencing a mental health crisis. The goal of that initiative is to de-escalate any conflict so it doesn't result in violence, and rather than resolve a situation where someone's experiencing a mental health crisis through arrest, we're making connections to care and into services. So that we have a pilot for that in the Central District right now. We're hopeful that grant funding will enable us to expand that program. And we've got applications in for a number of other programs as well, including a state program that the governor's office has recently established called the Maryland Criminal Information Network. We've applied for a system that will allow us to share information and data more easily with other jurisdictions throughout the state. So that concludes our presentation, and we're available for questions.
Thank you. I neglected to mention we've been joined by Councilman Chris Burnett from the 8th District and Council President Bernard C. Jack Young. Council President.
Thank you. On page 146 in the Volume 2 budget book, it shows a large increase in funds from Bloomberg philanthropies, philanthropies for the gunshot detection unit, license plate reader, and CCTV cameras. It also shows a cut of $421,343 for monitoring and maintenance. Will this cut the maintenance impact the city's ability to maintain the upkeep of the new resources that we have received from Bloomberg?
So I'm trying to find specifically the line that you're looking at, but
Service 757.
yeah. So okay, I see that. I think that's more of a reflection of shifting of funds. We have planned for upkeep and maintenance of the additional cameras and license plate readers that are being brought online. There is a $900,000 allocation, and I'm looking at my partners in finance. Yeah, but we did account for maintenance of all the new equipment that's coming online as a result of the grant that we received from Bloomberg Philanthropies.
So, sure, Mr. President, regarding the $400,000 credit that you see on page 146, it is not a reduction in service. It's actually more of a reflection of a reimbursement that they're receiving from the Housing Authority. The MOCJ has traditionally been receiving the grant, but it just wasn't reflected in the budget. So that's just reflecting the credit of receiving those funds.
All right, thank you. On page 138 in Volume 2, the budget for this service shows an overall decline from 1.8 million to 1.4 million. This includes a $266,699 reduction for the sexual assault response team, $237,942 for supervised visitation, and $508 for domestic violence. Can you explain how these cuts will impact the operation of this service, and are there any other service shifted to any other agency?
So, Mr. President, I'm going to let the Department of Finance chime in on this one as well. But what you're seeing there reflects, I think, a cleanup of some redundant allocations from last year that will not have a service impact on the agency this year. We do have a sexual assault response team coordinator within MOCJ and sub-grantees from that grant, as well as the grant for the visitation center. I think this was more of a budgeting change that needed to happen.
Sure. So, Mr. President, if you note on page 138, you will note that the reduction is related to the federal grant. So an exercise that our office has been doing in recent years in collaboration with the agencies is cleaning up their grant budgets to ensure that we are properly funding those. So if we had a budget appropriation for historical grants that we're no longer receiving, we've made those adjustments this year in the budget. So as Drew has mentioned, this will not impact the services that the unit is currently providing. It's just more of a cleanup of the budget.
Okay. On page 149 in the detail, volume 2, page 132 lists 4 services for this agency. And these services do not match the services on the following pages. This page omits Service 616, Juvenile Justice. This page also includes Service 618, Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. But on page 142, Service 618 is called Crime Prevention. For transparency purpose, in the future budget books, can you review the names of your service and include all services in your organization's chart?
So I think I followed most of that, Mr. President. As you know, we went through a bit of a restructuring of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. The Juvenile Justice Service was not included because all of the funds that were currently housed in that service were absorbed into other services. And so it was all zeros this year, which is why we didn't present that in the interest of time. We have tried to arrange the budget services this year to reflect current operations. The 4 of the main, the really core 4 functions of MOCJ, as we've set it up, are around law enforcement coordination, crime prevention and intervention through the Office of Community Safety and Engagement, City Watch, and seeking grant opportunities under administration. And that's the way that we've attempted to arrange the services. But going forward and in the future, of course, we will try to ensure that our services match the functions of the agency, and that's what we've tried to accomplish this year.
So I want to make sure I heard you right. Service 616, Juvenile Justice, is it eliminated?
So the funds that were within 616 Juvenile Justice were primarily transferred over into other services.
So what are we going to do for juveniles?
So we're doing a number of things. One of the major line items that was in that budget was a juvenile diversion function that was transferred over to the police department. So rather than being in MOCJ, it's currently within BPD, so it hasn't gone away.
That need not to be transferred over to the police department. It should remain in your agency.
Okay.
Or some other agency, not in an agency where there has been charges of corruption with the gun task force, and we're going to put that over there where thousands and thousands of young black males have been falsely arrested, drugs planted on them, guns planted on them. I don't want that service in there. So if we need to zero that out.
So we're certainly, have been very active in the juvenile justice space. One of the first things that we did in MOCJ was establish a regular meeting among all of the juvenile justice involved agencies. When we took over, we got the sense that communication among the agencies could be improved, and that relationships could be built, and that opportunities to collaborate could be identified. So we have established that meeting. The juvenile diversion coordinator that is now with BPD participates in those meetings. I hear your point, but I want to assure you that through that process, we have identified a few gaps to address. And one of the conversations that we have at each one of those meetings is what more can we do for juveniles in Baltimore City, and what gaps can we fill. So through the ROCA program, one of the populations that we're going to be serving is youth who are charged as adults for crimes. Typically, those youth sit in detention for a period of several months awaiting their transfer hearings. During that time, they're not receiving much support in the way of programming. So we're going to use the ROCA program to build relationships with those young people and help build life skills so that they are ready to reintegrate post-transfer hearing when they go into some sort of community supervision status. So that is one gap that we're looking to address. One of the grant applications that we put in that I neglected to mention earlier was for a federal Office of Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention federal program. We've come up with a proposal working with school police to serve 7th through 9th graders. It's a intervention that's aimed around early intervention. And these are young people who are arrested or detained or interact with school police in some way because of violent behavior. The school system has a number of things that it does for these youth now. We put in this grant application to be able to enhance the services that that population of youth is receiving through case management primarily. So we're calling it Baltimore City Youth Navigators Program. It's I think $150,000 or so grant application that would support several navigators that would work out of the Juvenile Justice Center. So, you know, we those are just two examples of, you know, through our conversation, we seek to identify gaps where, you know, there's a need that is not currently being met, and then we work together to come up with potential, you know, solutions, and those are a couple of examples. So,
Well, whose idea was it to transfer those funds to the police department, and why?
So that was a decision that was made, I think, prior to my becoming director of MOCJ. I would have to follow up on that.
Would you please follow up with that? And I don't want nobody to take the attitude or the meaning that I'm talking about all of the good men and women in the police department who go to work every day to do their job of protect and serve. It's for those officers who have violated the civil rights of the young black men that I'm talking about.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't want nobody to go out with the wrong idea.
Yes, sir. Understood.
So I had two questions. My first question is related to service number 757, and I read the explanation to it, but I'm not certain if I'm really, either I'm just not accepting the explanation or I just don't really understand it. But it's in reference to performance measure, number of arrests assisted and or initiated by City Watch cameras. Mm-hmm. And so for FY17, our target was 500. FY17, the actual is 315. FY18, the target was 1,000, but then it drops incredibly to 350 for FY19. And I'm just going to read what the explanation is, and if you can speak to it. It says, MOCJ's management and capacity to perform the work relating to City Watch has not changed. The agency anticipates that the number of arrests assisted and or initiated by CCTV cameras will decrease due to the changing marijuana laws. Additionally, there is an optimistic expectation that the mayor's violence reduction initiative will translate to overall reductions in crime. This should reduce the target for % reduction in crime in areas with crime cameras versus immediate surrounding areas. So are we saying that because we aren't going to be using the cameras to arrest as many people smoking marijuana, and that our efforts are going to be so tremendous with the recent crime reduction?
I think that this is older language that has been carried forward from prior years. I agree with you that I think that it needs to be updated. I don't really believe that we should be setting a goal for a number of arrests through CCTV cameras. Mm-hmm. I think that the language there was intended to reflect a reality in that the cameras, which are actively monitored, mm-hmm. And do sometimes assist in arrest when you know, criminal behavior is observed, you know, live on camera. Mm-hmm. There was a shift, you know, given the change in the way marijuana laws are enforced.
Yes.
And kind of the number of times that's happening where a camera monitor is watching someone on camera who may be using, selling marijuana or whatever. So that would contribute to reduction. That change is, you know, a number of years in the past at this point. I think.
Yeah, that's a dangerous measure, if
yeah.
not, you know,
Yeah, I think
put in some kind of context.
I think it needs to be updated. I think that applies to the some of the performance measures for MOCJ across the board. Like I said, we've done some restructuring of the agency, and I think that with next year's budget, we'll have revamp each of the performance measures to make them more reflective of the current priorities of the administration.
Okay. No,
Yeah, I don't think that's the best performance metric for the City Watch
Thank you
program.
for taking a look at that. So we don't expect to see that next year. My second question is related to, it's actually 3 different service areas, but they're all related. So it's service number 758, which is MOCJ, service number 621, which is BPD, and service number 781, which is the State's Attorney's Office. And all of those are administrative services, but none of them have any performance measures with them. So are we saying that those 3 activities are above measurement, or that we can't figure out how to measure those activities? I mean, I trust that you all are doing a great job, but I mean, even there should be some kind of.
So, Mr. Chair, I'll take that
Okay.
as that is more of a finance decision. So you will note in both volumes for all city agencies that we do not report performance measures for any of the administrative services.
Right, correct.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been something that's consistent.
It's been something consistent historically since we started doing the performance measures. They are not reflected the performance measures for the administrative services are not reflected in the budget books.
Right, and I guess what I'm asking, and I'm not saying that MOCJ is unique from any other agency, but it just seems as though, based upon the kind of oversight that they provide for a variety of different services related to public safety, that we should be looking at the effectiveness of this particular office and making certain that the initiatives that we deem necessary for the safety of our city are really being implemented and analyzed in a way so that they're truly effective. So I mean, I understand the decision, but I think that part of this whole budget process should be that no agency or no entity is above some sort of measurement to determine their effectiveness.
Yep. Understood. I mentioned earlier that our grants function is within the administration function, so I think going forward we can certainly provide updates or metrics at least around the number of grant dollars that have been brought in to support public safety initiatives and maybe some measures around those initiatives themselves as well. Your point is taken. I think that the majority of our measures regarding implementation and effectiveness will be contained in the other services,
right,
because a lot of what we do, particularly around law enforcement coordination, around crime prevention, are in some of the other services. So that's where the core of it's going to be. But your point is taken.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor the point, but so in some of those activities, I think we see a lot of the outcomes of your role, but your broader role is the collaboration of those different outcomes. And just for your own benefit, just for your own agency's benefit, it would be good to know if the way that you're managing those operations is effective. So,
Right.
Councilman Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vedder, thank you for being here. We are ecstatic that your office is actually up and running this year versus last year. And I'm personally excited, as you know, about Shot Spotters. Is something that a program I started working on in 2008 when I was a staff member, and I'm finally happy to see it come to fruition. But Mr. Chair, before I ask my questions, can I, for the good of the committee and the rest of the council, make a request that Mr. Vedder provide to the committee a detailed map and outlook of the expansion of the City Watch camera system that we're going to overtake?
Yes, and so we'll note that. And we've also been joined by Councilman Cohen from the 1st District and Karan Banks from the Mayor's Office.
Thank you. Mr. Vedder, to go back to the Council President's question around the juvenile justice line and it being pushed over to the police department, My concern is a little different from the council president. So for me, when we transfer those things over, but also knowing the other services that we have seen go by the wayside over the past few years. For example, we had the health department right before you in Operation Safe Kids. You know that we used to have the HYPE program where we targeted and work with those young teenagers most at risk. And to see that kind of stuff go away and then not have it replaced in your budget is very troubling for me, because we know that we can have that kind of impact. And seeing is, for me, when things are being transferred from one agency to another instead of being added on, like why doesn't your office operate a program and the police department? And why doesn't the health department have Operation Safe Kids and we have Safe Streets in Roca? That's where we think that we should be going when we're talking about truly getting to the crux of the issue of violence in the city of Baltimore. So my question to you is, are there plans to deal with that issue within MOCJ? Will you guys go back to having those kind of programs in MOCJ that works through with direct services to young people and adults to try to reduce violence in the city?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so appreciate the question, Councilman Scott. I'll note a couple of things. I think the very brief answer to your question is yes, we're very interested in doing those things. I think we have begun that process. One thing that I'll note is that there's a provision in the consent decree which requires an assessment to be completed of youth diversion services in the city. And there's been a work group that's come together that's being chaired by the Mayor's Office of Human Services that we're participating in, as well as the police department and other agencies, to assess what's out there and what some of the needs are. I think it's our hope to use that process to identify some specific gaps where MOCJ or the health department or other agencies could play a greater role. So, you know, like I've mentioned a few times now, we've been having these conversations with the partners in the juvenile justice system, and we have identified a couple of gaps which we've actively stepped up to try to fill. One is dedicating a portion of that population that will be served through ROCA to juveniles, which is a little bit different from the way the model operates elsewhere, where it's primarily geared towards young adults. But we will be adding a juvenile component to the replication here in Baltimore City that will be around, centered around the most at-risk juveniles, similar to what OSK was. And it'll be those youth who are charged as adults for crimes. So these are going to be armed robberies, carjackings, shootings in the worst cases. But we'll be providing services to that population through ROCA. Another thing that emerged in our conversations was, the lack of, case management, navigation, and support for the kids who get in trouble for serious things at school. So we worked with Chief Ham at School Police and developed a proposal for a program that we submitted a grant application for. That will be directly run by MOCJ if we get those funds. So that will be a direct service that we provide. So, through the assessment that's going to be done, through the continued conversations that we're having with our partners, and just through the direction that we're taking the office, we do want to become much more active in those spaces.
Thank you, and I look forward to hopefully doing next year's budget for us to have the conversation about expanding diversion. And I would just like to say for the record that it shouldn't require you to go out and get grants. We fund a lot of things in the city's budget. We should definitely make this a priority for us to fund, because we know it has the impact. If we are diverting these things away, we're investing in this beforehand, then we won't have to worry about BPD going out and wrangling kids and spending time doing things that police officers actually isn't their job to do. My second question, Mr. Vedder, is around the Safe Streets. As you know, this time last year, this council banned it to Safe Streets from extinction. Can you go a little bit deeper into the rollout of the new program and how things are going so far?
Yeah, absolutely. The budget includes funding to continue supporting the 4 existing sites that we have in the Safe Streets program. You're familiar with all of those: Park Heights, McElderry Park, Cherry Hill, Sandtown. So those will continue, but the budget also includes funding to support those sites more through getting a couple of sites up to full staffing. Even though the program maintained from last year, a couple of sites are below optimal levels of staffing right now. So we're going to get all of the current sites up to optimal staffing, as well as demonstrate to the Safe Streets staff that we valued their work through pay increases, which they haven't received in a number of years. So we think that when we talk about expansion, support of the current sites is where that whole conversation needs to start. But you're also familiar with the fact that the mayor has set the goal of expanding the Safe Streets program by 6 additional sites. So there's funding in the budget to support that. The way that we're doing that is we're going to do it incrementally. We're going to add 3 sites now, and then we're going to add 3 sites once those that first batch of 3 is operational. It's going to be a competitive process. Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice put an RFP out for interested community-based organizations to submit proposals. We had the bidders conference for that last week. We were extremely encouraged by the interest that appeared to be there among the community and among potential operators. So we're anticipating that we're going to get some really strong proposals for those first 3 sites. So the applications are due on June 13th. They'll be evaluated based off of a scoring rubric that was included within the RFP. And we'll make those awards by July 1. So the expansion process will start July 1. We anticipate that it'll take a number of months to identify staff, hire staff, get them trained, get the sites operational. And once those sites are up and running, we'll do another RFP round, do the process over again to get up to the full 10 sites for the program. And I want to ask Mr. Roper if he has anything to add to that. Tyrone's really helping to manage the kind of day-to-day expansion process with Safe Streets.
And as Mr. Roper comes, we've been joined by Councilman Slifer from the 5th District. And after Mr. Roper responds to Councilman Scott's question, we have about 20 minutes left in this particular panel, so I'm going to ask my colleagues to ask your questions as succinctly as possible so that we can get through the questions prior to our 12 o'clock stop.
Okay. Mr. Roper. So good afternoon, Council President, members of the Council, Councilman Scott. So one of the other things that we are clear about as it relates to the expansion of Safe Streets is fully understanding the public health approach to reducing violence, right? So it's the ecological perspective. So what that involves is ensuring that these ancillary supports are provided for the staff of Safe Streets as well as the participants that engage. So we're going to be working closely with My Brother's Keeper as well as Family League to be able to bring on dollars to support any types of additional supports or services that staff may need and or the participants. So it's a very broad approach that we're looking at as far as this expansion.
Thank you, Mr. Vedder, and thank you also for your work on bringing a gun crime intelligence center to the city. That's something near and dear to my heart.
Councilwoman Middleton.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, and to your criminal justice team, thank you for the service that you continue to do. And just want to make a comment about Safe Streets, which the Park Heights Safe Streets has been a long-standing program, but just a footnote, there are citizens out there that still does not see the effectiveness, so performance measures and what they do is just extremely important, especially since we're going through this expansion. And my colleague, Councilman Pickett, had asked the questions on some of these areas that did not have performance measures, and you answered that question. But there is one that does have performance measures, the Service 618 Crime Prevention on page 142. There were 2 performance measures, the number of non-custodial parent and child interaction supervised, and then the number of community awareness events organized have seen a decline. Can you explain why the FY17 numbers did not meet their target?
So I'm going to defer to Mr. Roper on this question after I briefly respond. The first one around child interaction supervised has to do with the visitation center. That was a program that has been funded through a federal grant that expired at the end of last year. We had reapplied for the funding, and we were awarded that funding again for another 3 years late last year. So we'll have a full fiscal year's worth of operation and goals around the number of interactions and exchanges that are supervised. So we expect to see a boost in activity there. The community awareness events organized was a performance measure that was carried over from the health department's budget service. I noticed the same thing about the decline in community awareness events organized. I believe that it's probably an error because I know that the Safe Streets has community events every single week. So that's something that we're trying to get straightened out. Mr. Roper.
Councilwoman Middleton, forgive me. So I have the numbers, right? So unfortunately, they just weren't included in the report. So for FY17, there were a total of 112 events that occurred, community awareness events that occurred, with a total estimated attendance around 9,800 individuals attended. That was roughly around 90 individuals per event. And currently, for this current fiscal year, there's been roughly 114 community awareness events that's been held, with an estimated attendance around 13,000, roughly 114 individuals attending each of those events. So,
thank you, thank you. So it's just a point that it's crucial to, because I know the Safe Streets group are out there in the community, and we need to keep all that information and the progress, and just to really capture how effective they are, especially since you're expanding. So thanks again.
Yep. Before I go to Councilman Burnett, I want to just dovetail off of what Councilwoman Middleton said related to Safe Streets. And one of the outputs is the number of conflict mediations conducted through Safe Streets. Maybe this is just my personal opinion, that the real success of Safe Streets is going to be rather reflected in the number of mediators that are created, as opposed to Safe Street workers always being the one to mediate the conflict. The real success is going to be how many mediators they create as a result of their intervention, because that should be what our goal is, to replicate themselves in the other individuals that they engage, so that they're not coming at the end of the conflict or near the middle of the conflict, but those conflicts are being resolved at their initiation.
Yeah, understood. And just a brief comment on that. We'll certainly look at whether that can be captured, but just want to remind the council that one of the main goals of the Safe Streets program is to denorm violence, as a solution to problems, and that is something that's measured through the Cure Violence model, which exists in many other towns and cities throughout the country. And it's something that's been evaluated as part of evaluations of Safe Streets in the past. So that's certainly something that we'll be looking to monitor as well. Are we changing attitudes and feelings about violence within those Safe Streets areas?
And just to added footnote that Safe Streets is also a form of job creation for people that have been through the criminal justice system and a process, and they are given a job basically in the community, and job creation is a very important piece here for the success of alleviating crime in the city as well.
So through the expansion that we're undergoing right now, we'll be adding about 50 jobs through the Safe Streets programs
50?
to expand and staff the new sites. So
wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Drew, for your partnership and your agency, especially around the issue of human trafficking. It's been an excellent partnership so far in doing that work. The question I had was unrelated to that, because we talk about that a lot on the task force, was around, I think I might have lost my page. There were cuts, it looked like, oh, here we go. Service number 617, page 140. It looks like you've taken some substantial cuts to the sexual assault response team, as well as domestic violence. Are those transfers to different programs, or are those actual program reductions?
So, thank you, Councilman, for the question. I think this was similar to a question that was asked by the Council President. As it relates to the sexual assault response team, it's not a cut in services. Rather, that was a cleanup of some redundant funds that did not need to be carried forward. And I'll defer to the Department of Finance to provide a more detailed explanation on that. As it relates to the domestic violence, that was a transfer as well. That reflects a pass-through funding arrangement that we have where we're providing funding to the House of Ruth domestic violence shelter. That is, the funding is special funds, so it's a special fund account. The revenue comes from a portion of marriage licenses, actually. It's a longstanding program where a portion of those funds goes to support domestic violence shelters managed by the House of Ruth, and we can provide more details on that if you're interested. But that it's my understanding that program hasn't gone away, but that has been absorbed into another, I think, under administration within MOCJ's budget under the special funds unallocated there.
Could you provide more clarity?
Yes, sure. So the response is similar to earlier. In the process of really digging deep into the grants budget, we realized that there were duplicate funding. So because of the duplicate and overstated funding, we reconciled all of those grant appropriation and restructured the budget to actually reflect what the agency will truly receive.
Okay. That was it. I was just a little bit disturbed by that, just given the context of conversation I had with your staff member from your sexual assault response team about sort of the intersectionalities between in-home violence and that the translation into community-based violence, and just did not want, reductions in service to be, impacted when we have so much community violence, and we know that kids are experiencing trauma in their homes, and a lot of that translates to their relationships outside of the home and how they interact with others, and likelihood to go into a violent lifestyle. So
Thanks,
it's good to hear that the program isn't being impacted. That was all I had, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Drew. Spent part of my morning with Councilman Bullock over at Southwest Charter this morning, where a group of sixth graders presented some really compelling research on lead poisoning and the impact it has on crime and violence in our city. Specifically around hyperactivity, there's a bunch of research I read when I was in grad school showing that around the time when we banned lead gasoline, and then you kind of see this decline in crime across most of the country as folks aged up. As we know, we still have issues in this city with lead in homes, we just talked last night about the water fountains at schools. I'm curious if MOCJ is focused on this issue, is working with Green and Healthy Homes or any other groups that deal with it, and is working on abatement or sort of partnering with those that are, because again, I think this is one of the underlying causes of some of the crime in our city, and we have an obligation to not ignore it, but confront it.
So thanks, Councilman Cohen. First, I'd like to give kudos to the sixth graders that did that research on lead poisoning.
They were really good.
Yeah,
and I'll let them know you gave kudos.
Very impressive. Yeah. We're certainly supportive of agencies that are working on lead abatement issues, housing and health, and others. We don't currently have any programs aimed specifically at that issue. Generally speaking, the direction we're trying to take the office is to have our programs and initiatives be evidence-based and be backed by research. And I think a lot of the things that we've undertaken to do fall into that category. So definitely interested in talking about that more. I will task our team with doing some research into that and getting a better sense of kind of the organizations outside of government that are doing this type of work now, and identify any ways that we can be more supportive, because the point is well taken.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is actually a large body of evidence that our sixth grade friends sort of built off of that will show some correlation in terms of lead use and how crime has kind of gone up and down, and it remains a major challenge in our city.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. Drew, I sent an email earlier about recognition, that facial recognition software. Can you talk about the status of any efforts MOCJ has to explore new technologies like that, especially with relation to City Watch camera program?
Yes. So we do play a coordinating role as it relates to public safety technology. We just launched ShotSpotter on the west side of the city yesterday, actually. Kind of looking at, and that's a sensor-based technology. And as the City Watch network continues to expand, when we complete these current projects, we're going to be, well above 800 cameras. We can't possibly actively monitor all of those cameras at the same time with human beings. It's just not practical or feasible. So the direction that we're looking to go with monitoring is to be more alert and sensor-based. And I mentioned ShotSpotter in the context of that question because when an alert goes off, you can use the alert to drive your camera monitoring activity. So when an alert goes off and you see the location, you can check to see which City Watch cameras are in the area and then base your live active monitoring around that. Facial recognition is another one of those potential technologies that's out there. We have done some research around it. It's our conclusion so far that the technology is not quite good enough on City Watch cameras to be particularly useful yet. It's another thing that we're also concerned about, the balance between privacy and safety and the potential for bias that's built into certain technologies as well. So those are all things that we evaluate, but certainly the integration of other technologies into the cameras, integration of technology generally is the direction that public safety technology is going, and we're going to continue to evaluate that and ensure that we're kind of at the leading edge in Baltimore. So,
thank you, Councilwoman Sneed.
Thank you. I just have a question in reference to Safe Streets as well. I'm curious with the program expanding, how are these new entities that are going after the money, how are they going to be chosen?
So the RFP, the request for proposals, contains criteria for all of the entities. It also contains scoring broken down by category. And so each of the applications is going to be reviewed for responsiveness to each of the criteria that are in the RFP and according to the scoring rubric that's in the RFP. And that's going to be the process.
So will community...
That's available publicly.
Will community members be a part of this process?
Yeah, so we are in the process of assembling an evaluation committee to assist with the scoring. It's our intention to make that evaluation committee diverse and reflective of the community, and it will not just be members of MOCJ and city government that are making those decisions, but we're involving external stakeholders as evaluators as well.
I think I've been hearing from different community members, and they're afraid that the wrong nonprofit will get this money or the wrong entity will get this money, and it won't reflect, it won't help our community. Like we won't see we won't see the money that's supposed to come into the community that's supposed to make a difference. So
We're concerned about the same issue as well. So definitely we'll be cognizant of that. I would note, though, that one of the really important things with Safe Streets operators is sustainability of the organization. And I think some lessons have been learned in the past that you need to have an organization as an operator that has some a track record and has some stability, just in terms of basic things like being able to meet payroll and manage, that number of staff and all of the reporting requirements that go along with operating a Safe Streets site. So we're balancing the need to have sustainable operators with the need to make the program as reflective of the community as possible. So
can I request that we just submit the requirements to the committee?
we can absolutely do that. They're in fact publicly available right now. The RFP is posted on CityBuy, and that contains all of the eligibility requirements and the scoring.
And they'll
criteria.
just, if that can just be given to the community, that would be great. So
Can you just send us an email, me and Councilwoman Sneed, a link to it?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you, Drew. Councilman Stokes?
First, I want to thank Safe Streets for all the fires that you put out. I also want to thank the mayor for expanding the program and actually bringing it to the 12th district and make sure you have the funding there. But next month, we had over at St. Ambrose Kennedy Park, we got a grant for $1.3 million, and they have an amphitheater. It's going to be real nice. And just a suggestion to Safe Streets, we're going to have a lot of pools opening, and sometimes we have some problems in our pools, and we want to at least kind of not have our police sitting at the pools all day when they can be fighting crime. So I don't know if Safe Streets actually looking at that particular issue at some of the pools during the summer once they open up. It's just a suggestion, though.
So I think we can look into that issue specifically. I will say that within the Safe Street catchment areas now, they do provide presence at large community gatherings and events like that. So that's not something that's unprecedented for the program to address.
Thank you.
Good, Council. Colleagues, anyone else? You sure? Some at recess? Press, you good? Okay, Drew, thank you very much. We're in recess. We'll be coming back at 12:30 for panel on youth services.